Hello and welcome to today's King's India Institute lunchtime if you're in London or tea time if you're in India seminar. We have been blessed this term with being able to discuss and to some extent launch a host of really interesting books, and today's discussion will recognise the forthcoming publication of a new book by Dr. Kalairasan and Professor Vijaya Bhaskar, entitled The Dravidian Model, Interpreting the Political Economy of Tamil Nadu. And I'm really delighted that both authors can be with us today. Professor Vijaya Bhaskar is professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies in Chennai, and joining us from Chennai. I assume, actually, I hadn't checked, but I imagine that's the case. And Dr. Kalairasan is currently a Fulbright Nehru postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us. I'm also very pleased to say that we have Dr. Judith Heyer from the University of Oxford, coming along on this journey as a discussant, having read the proofs of the book. So the way we will structure the discussion today is that the authors will speak for about 40-45 minutes to present an overview of the book, its principal arguments, and Judith will then offer her reflections before we open out to Q&A. I should say that I am really excited about this book, just as I am more generally about studies which seriously engage with explanations of the political economy of development of individual states. There is a venerable tradition of state-level studies of politics and political economy in India, but I think much of that literature is in some ways becoming a little dated. It grew out of the period of political and economic regionalization that accompanied liberalization, and I think the current juncture really presents new dilemmas and new questions for reflection and reassessment about the ways that we think about models of development that have taken shape at the state level. So it's an exciting book, and I will hand over to the authors to tell us more. And I think Kalai is going to go first.
Yeah. Thank you. Sincere thanks to everybody. It's particularly to Professor Louis Stellin for making this event possible. Can I share the my slides?
Should be able to.
I should also just have said before we started, just so that our attendees know, that we are recording today's seminar. So there will be a publicly accessible recording after the webinar.
Thank you, Professor Louis Stellin, for making this event possible. Her work on particular subnational politics has inspired us in many ways. We also thank Professor Judith Heyer for agreeing to be a discussant. Often, human well-being is defined by people's location, be it poorer region in the world or groups one belong to within a region, whether they are low caste or the Dalits or the people of color. Often their efforts in mobilization against the deprivation do not move beyond immediate questions of dignity. Hence, one sees persistent divergence in well-being across regions, even across groups within a region. Economists and political scientists generally pose this important question in this regard. Why do some regions do well in growth but lack begin in human development, while others do well in human development but not in growth? Similarly, on the context of ethnicity or caste mobilization, why do some mobilization against status-based inequalities do not deliver development? Otherwise, you can ask the question in other terms, when does such mobilization for dignity deliver development along with representation in democracies? These are two persistent questions in the two different track. But based on case studies of Tamil Nadu, its own political and development trajectory, we argue offers some lessons to address this puzzle in the context of India. We show that through caste-based mobilization and building solidarities across heterogeneous low-caste groups, the state has been able to deliver on both and growth and development fronts. If high levels in human development in Himachal Pradesh, for instance, Kerala, has not translated into dynamism in the productive economy, productive dynamism in the states such as Maharashtra and Gujarat has not been accompanied by corresponding improvement in human well-being, particularly education and health. This paradox is being exemplified by the recent, what is known as Bhagavati-Sen debate, which took place around 2014 in India. While Bhagavati's proposition makes a case for a trickle-down approach where growth translates into a development as it provides resources for human development, particularly a revenue for expenditure to make an expenditure in education and health. On the other hand, Sen and John Rees make a case for a capability-centered approach path where investment in education and health should be prioritized, which can then translate into economic development. Basically, you begin with your investment in education and health, and which naturally translate into growth, better growth, which is broad-based. According to them, this path is likely to be more inclusive, which is Sen and John Rees. So both positions draw empirical support from the experience of subnational states in India, which is for Bhagavati, it is Gujarat, for Sen, it is Kerala. This is the two trajectory that they used in making this debate. We argue that the Tamil Nadu experience shows the possibilities of combining these two processes simultaneously, and these two processes need not be sequential, which is growth and development need not be a sequential, can go together. This is in the track of regions. If you take the second puzzle which we argued, which is why low-cost mobilization often confined with the dignity not deliver redistribution. For instance, the recent book by Amit Aguja, his work, he says in his book, Mobilizing the Marginalized, the lower caste mobilization need not necessarily translate into development or redistribution. At some context, it does. That's what is puzzle. Why in some contexts it happens, in other contexts it doesn't happen. But Tamil Nadu seems to be combining both in the here as well. So what we are trying to say is two contexts, both growth and development at the regional level and of the dignity and development in the social front. Combining these two is the case that we are trying to make an argument here. How that has happened? A specific conception of social justice within caste society, we argue, is critical to this development trajectory. It made possible a move from politics of identity, recognition, to politics of development, redistribution, to an extent combining both for development. Such development is inseparable from the question of dignity because in the absence of adequate resources to avoid opportunities, mere grant of formal freedom to low caste cannot ensure social justice. Freedom involves the power to act and the capacity to do things. This simultaneity of ensuring freedom and endowing the deprived with the material resources to act has substantially shaped development in the state. Our narrative of the development trajectory of Tamil Nadu suggests that the populist mobilization around a non-essentialized Dravidian Tamil identity, a demand for social justice, has indeed worked to expand freedom and reduce inequalities across caste. Operating within the constitutional democratic framework, the state experience highlights a democratization of economic life that can be opened within this constitutional framework. This is particularly important in the post-colonial societies where mobilization often drawn upon essentialized, exclusive identities, which is constructing people necessarily exclude some identities if you include some identities in your construction of people. So that tend to undermine the prospects of democratizing social relations, because it necessarily excludes if you essentialize identity in some context. The state political experience hence suggests that it is indeed possible to institutionalize an inclusive populist mobilization leading to a comparatively, relatively egalitarian development trajectory in the global south. So we use a kind of mixed method design, combining historical analysis that rests on archival material with the secondary data supported with the field work. To highlight the distinct trajectory of the state, we also provide data on various development parameters based mobilizing the data that are available in relation to Maharashtra, Gujarat, to a limited extent Kerala. To explain these outcomes, we also drawn upon conceptual tools from Gramsci and Laclau to explain how the process of populist mobilization and its electoral success, and even the institutionalization of those welfare interventions and the limits of those interventions. We using Laclau and Gramsci, we map this historical trajectory. If you look at the conceptual creed, I just give briefly explain what the conceptual creed we used in making this case making this case possible. As stated earlier, the success of Tamil Nadu lies in its ability to build an historical block of heterogeneous subalterns to secure dignity and development. Social mobilization managed to forge a Dravidian Tamil identity to build a Gramscian national popular project. In the sense, you have a diverse groups. It's a big question in the social science. When does a collective action takes place in a stratified society? Obviously, you have a huge diverse caste groups. You have to bring them under together at some identity, at some form, under some platform. You call it like. So that is something happened through what we call as a historical block. It's a political labor. Simply, it's a political labor. So we explain this mobilization through, again, once you build a national block, and how that national block turns out to be a populist or a people project in getting into institutional structure. There we use the Laclau in that sense. And actually, Laclau's project really works as, in a way, as it provides a people, which is in a framework, constructing people comprised of the heterogeneous group with the diverse social demands and a building logic of equivalence against a cultural economic elite, which means here you have a diverse groups and diverse demands flowing from this diverse set of population. So we need to make a common identity, a common equivalence, connecting all of the social demands and build a block. So that's what we call as a logic of equivalence from the Laclau, and positioning a common cultural economic elite. If a non-electoral mobilizations crystallize in building this historical block and also establish a normative common sense around that social demands through a strong critique of power structures and its ideologies that sustained caste inequalities in the context of India, particularly in Tamil Nadu. So then you mobilize for the electoral dividends and institutionalize populism in the state. This institutionalization has in turn led to a series of programmatic interventions that we call as have undermined the prevailing relation of injustice based on caste status. In the sense, you build a historical block, construct a people, translate their concerns as through a form interventions, political in an institutional framework, which we call as a two sort of intervention took place in the state of in Tamil Nadu in particular. What we define as these two trends of intervention, as one is social popular, the other one is the economic popular. While both share certain common characteristics, the domain of social popular constitute a rights-based intervention ensuring inclusive access to modern sectors and public goods. The social popular has definite redistributive content to it. For instance, affirmative action policies, land reform, legislation for equal property rights for women are some example of what we call as a social popular, which has a redistributive content. On the other hand, economic popular policies are largely rooted in patronage and driven by short-term electoral cycles. They tend to address often immediate concerns of absolute poverty. For example, expansion of subsidies is a typical example. While we make this analytical distinction between the social popular and economic popular, both can often intersect. In the sense, the short-term electorally driven economic popular can also have a durable social outcome. For instance, securing access to food on highly subsidized item, for example, in play, the household can afford to invest in education health, which is in a way has a longer effect. So similarly, one can think of many other examples how the in short-term interventions can also longer effect in terms of social outcomes. Such interventions are likely to increase for instance, the food price, food subsidy intervention can increase the reserve price of labor in the labor market and their ability to bargain with the capital and capital as well. So what we are trying to argue here is the intervention that we call as a redistributive intervention, which is land reform or affirmative action or other kind of, which is some way directly related to the property or some way of fundamental in the nature, can have a longer, obviously, which is well recorded. But the short-term electorally driven, what we call as economic popular also can have a long, durable positive outcome of it. That's our claim. Can work actually together, which worked in the context of Tamil Nadu. That is our argument. Having laid out this conceptual framework for understanding the processes at work, we move on to highlight a few interventions across specific domains that have led to a better developmental outcomes in the state. We begin with the domain of education. Myron Weiner, in his landmark book, The Child and the State in India, makes a powerful argument that the India's educational policy has been historically biased towards elite. In a way, he's trying to answer comparatively, India, given its economic structure and other, India was really doing bad in education domain, particularly at the primary education, poor, kept many of them are poor, Indian poor. So then he by doing a extensive field work and talking to bureaucrats and administrative structure in the Dravidian planning, he argued that this is essentially comes from the elitist understanding of policy structure, particularly prioritizing tertiary education at the expense of primary education, which is what the most of the democracy went with when they got independence historically. Even if you take to map the historical trajectory of the Europe, for him it is actually rooted in the caste elitism. According to Weiner, the caste elitism posted a bias towards tertiary education for elites at the expense of mass education, and also endorsed by the ascriptive low status for manual labor. In fact, according to him, the divide between the mental and manual labor gets reenacted through modern education system. Tamil Nadu, we suggest, has a long history of countering this bias by political and policy focus on primary education to begin with, and a gradual shift in its emphasis towards higher education, which normally took place post-50s, particularly post-80s to be specific. The role of intervention, such as the noon meal scheme, that goes back to the Justice Party government in 20th century, is well known. In addition to, we highlight the role of physical and social infrastructure, such as hostels for low caste and the transport and tuition subsidies that made education one of the inclusive, relatively low cost in the country. In the domain of higher education too, along with creation of such supportive infrastructure, we demonstrate how the state used caste-based reservation to broad-based entry and simultaneously address differences within this caste groups. Here, what we are arguing is the state has been able to manage in higher education. So as I mentioned, as it's shown in the slide, it about roughly 48% of class enrollment ratio in higher education, one of the highest. It is in terms of not just in the aggregate terms. Even if you look at the social inclusion, you find relatively improvement or relatively distributed among the low caste within Dalits, within the OBCs. Even within the differences within the Dalit and the OBCs also addressed, having a separate quota system for most backward caste, and within Dalit for the for Arundhatiya. So this is something happening in the North recent time for a different purpose. But whereas this sort of inclusion, reworking the policies to make the excluded group back into the reservation domain has been happening for quite a while. Somehow it's been able to manage, but we can even provide evidence based on the recent administrative data. What are the caste groups which could get into the medical services or other professional services, even in the professional jobs in the state-funded jobs. So this is fairly distributed in that sense. So definitely what we're arguing here in the education, it has worked, not only enhancing the total percentage of higher education, say the GER measured by GER, and also broadly, relatively well distributed among the caste groups. Such policies democratize human capital, since it's broad-based, and of course higher education matters in the current economic structure. This is important not merely in terms of inclusive growth, which we argued in the case of caste mobilization, but also relates to the question of dignity, as it offers freedom to aspire. In the absence of adequate resources to avoid opportunities, mere grant of formal freedom to low caste cannot ensure social justice. Freedom, therefore, involves the power to act and the capacity to do things. This simultaneity of ensuring freedom and endowing the deprived with material resources to act has substantially shaped development in the state. And this commitment to reversing the elite bias is also visible in the domain of health education, in health sector, which is fairly noted, which this state has done relatively well. If you look at the John Rees and Sen's book, and other, even how we have provided data in our book, also it's fairly recorded that relatively, for instance, TFR or IMR and certain basic health indicators is done better. This is, we argue, is outcome of a longer history of institutional intervention in the health sector. Just we provide a basic. For instance, if forming the first planning commission in India, which has happened in the 70s when the, 71, when second time the DMK came into power, with a task force constituted specifically for healthcare and investment in public health infrastructure and democratization of social profile of health professional. So how this happened, it's a multiple process. I'm summarizing with a few sentences on each of these interventions. In the sense, the investment in public health infrastructure goes to the longer time. Public health, which begins with Justice Party and the Madras presidency, and some way in the post-independence, so some of those policies inherited that policy, continued. And democratizing the social profile, again, as I mentioned earlier, the reservation policies and state-led medical hospitals ensured quantity, and the reservation policies ensure the diversity of those professionals. This both simultaneously working. It is not, if you look at the total percentage of medical seats available in the state medical colleges, which is one of the highest. So obviously you maintain the quantity and also ensure a social inclusion through the reservation policies, particularly for health professionals. Why the health professional through the reservation policies important, particularly even for the delivery. I'll come back to that question later, but this happened. Then the second, the most important is the innovative drug procurement, which we'll also discuss later in detail how that works. So this we call some of these policies, which is infrastructure, ensuring social profile of health professional, innovative drug, all we call as a, in our earlier conception as a social popular, which has definitely a redistributive content to it. And there are also other policies, which is, say, insurance, subsidized health insurance, noon meal schemes, expansion of content and coverage, or even other maternity benefits. We call all of this will fall under within the health as an economic popular intervention. If the social popular policies helped building a public health infrastructure, democratized some way of the health governance, the economic popular policies enhanced its coverage and added new schemes to this content. We give just given one example to begin with. the Tamil Nadu Medical Service Corporation, which is key actually, which is it is very well known among the health economists in India. Why it is important? Because this centralized provision of essential drugs, diagnostics at the public health facilities has reduced out-of-pocket expenditure in the health of household, which is fairly recorded. In the sense, you centralize the drug provision and ensure its availability in each public hospitals, and even some of the medicines are at free of cost, which actually some way shock that one would incur for any ailment, then actually it gets sorted out some way. So because the immediate shock to the household through the out-of-pocket expenditure has been seen as a key. In fact, it is known as a catastrophic event in the health literature. So that actually some way taken care by these boards. And even because of the centralization, you could also regulate the market structure, even the private market structure, in the sense of influencing the price level of the drugs. We trace this process and show how the state has ensured better public health infrastructure through this mechanism, countering the elite bias towards tertiary care, which is against general Indian pattern. For instance, there are some case studies, for instance, the UP, or maybe in other state one can say, which is from the health economics perspective. If you look at the composition of expenditure that goes to the tertiary sector, the composition of the expenditure that goes to the preventive public health sector is completely different. So some way the composition also the state was able to maintain, make that, is tilted towards the primary health care, the public health care. So showing this, then we also show, in addition to historically mobilizing the resources that is available for public health infrastructure, and the entry of low cost into the medical professional through affirmative action, all facilitated even ensuring some set of access even in the public system through what sociologists call weak ties. What this weak ties means, they call if a service provided in the public sector or even otherwise is some way able to connect or closer to the caretakers, care seekers, there could be possibilities of ensuring the access better. In the sense, if you can have a public infrastructure well placed, if that public infrastructure is not accessible to the many, even for the care seekers, particularly in health, it became a serious issue. It is actually, if you look at NFH's National Family Health Survey, you would find which are the state has access to, or the better access, percentage of people go accessing the health services. You clearly find this correlation between these two. So that some way we call as a democratization of this access facilitated through these reservation policies. Of course, innovative structures also have allowed the state to retain healthcare professionals in the public system. In the sense, this is you build an incentive structure for the healthcare professionals to spend certain years of their time in the rural India, Tamil Nadu. Therefore, you build an incentive system. If you spend how many years in the rural infrastructure, rural health system, then you get a certain incentive for your higher education and other purpose. So some way incentive-based way of retaining the doctors also worked in ensuring this access to the remote area and the rural area. Finally, the state has been also pioneer in the expansion of, which is again the very most contentious of the state also was, as a pioneer in building a corporatization of the, opening up the corporatization of the hospital. This is something bustling for the many, how the corporatization of, or the privatization also coexisted with the public sector, which is something is, we also was puzzled. Actually, when we looked at the trend, this process began in the 90s of this corporatization and the privatization in late 80s. But we also see that at the same time, the expansion of the public capacity as well. The sense the number of additional hospitals came in, or the number of even medical colleges came in across districts. So which we are not sure in the case of, is it just naturally happened that expansion of public care and public hospitals also deepened along with privatization, because privatization is rampant now. So both some ways seems to be coexisting, in fact deepened, which is something needs a further inquiry, but data suggests is both clearly has coexisted for last 30 years, if you map from the 90s onwards.
I just want to give you a, sorry, I just want to interrupt, to give you a bit of a time warning. We're at 12:30 now, so
Yeah, just a minute. I just I'm in the last point. Yeah, thank you, Luis. Yeah, just last point. Yeah. So we say this coexisted and co-expanded of the public and private. However, it is equally important to highlight the limits within these domains. While the state has done well in relative terms in domain of health and education, problem of quality of services actually has emerged. In the sense, many of these aggregate numbers you have achieved. You can show the GR, you can show the access, you can show number of indicators in the health and education in terms of quantitative terms, but quality of the service is becoming now a serious issue, which actually, we'll discuss at the end of the presentation. But it is different set of problems, what we call as a new realities and new problems. We'll come back to this question later. Now we turn to the how this policies or intervention in the education, health, facilitated or went along with democratization of capital that we dealt with. Now I invite my co-author, Professor Vijay Bhaskar, to talk on this. Yeah. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you, Kalai. And thanks again to the organizers for making this possible. Am I audible? Is it okay? Thank you. Yeah. By and large, we all have heard of a standard popular narrative that the state's governance is excessively focused on ensuring welfare benefits for the lower caste at the expense of economic dynamism. Or if people talk about economic dynamism, it was also always been in terms of inheriting a historical legacy. Our analysis of the state's experience, however, tells a different story. Not only does the state continue to have a vibrant manufacturing and high-end services like software sector, the state also has a higher share of lower caste entrepreneurs compared to Maharashtra and Gujarat, which are the other equally dynamic states. In fact, 1 in 4 Dalit enterprises in the country is located in the state. So the question clearly is, what makes this possible? In the Dravidian imagination, there are 2 factors that hindered democratizing capital accumulation in the region. First, the ideologues held that the caste system rendered actors from certain castes as born capitalists and some others as born laborers. In other words, there are clear-cut caste-based barriers for entry into the world of capital accumulation. Second, the dominance of pan-Indian mercantile capital, largely Marwari and Banya capital in the region, was seen to prevent modernization of the economy and entry of Tamils into business. C.N. Annadurai, founding member of the DMK, for instance, speaking in the Rajya Sabha in 1962, invoked a southern question in Italy, which essentially talked about economic inequalities across regions there, to seek economic advancement of the Tamil region. So in our book, we trace 3 pathways through which this process of democratization unfolded. To begin with is the diffusion of what we refer to as a productivist ethos. That is a belief that those who toil should reap the benefits of this labor, unlike caste elites who they held actually benefited by extracting rents of those who are actually laboring in the fields. Accompanying this was also a belief that industrialization is critical to undermine social hierarchies, because traditional occupations or traditional work was completely determined by caste. So industrialization allows this possibility to break these caste-based barriers to access multiple occupations. Together, this generated, ever since the early colonial period, early 20th century, this generated a consistent popular demand for industrialization. And since infrastructure was critical to such modernization, such demands translated into investments in physical and social infrastructure, which allowed for more diffused entry into the domain of capital accumulation. And finally, we point out that specific policies in the domain of industrialization and servitization, that is, policies directly aimed to improve this domain of industries, have also enabled this process. We therefore contest the claim in our book that politicians concentrated on social sectors alone, leaving entrepreneurs pretty much to themselves. In tracing this process, we kind of identified 4 different temporal phases. Kalai, can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. The first phase overlaps with the colonial period, which is where you first witness the emergence of such a productive ethos and a social demand for modern industries. It may not be out of place to actually suggest, make the point here that it was in Madras presidency that you actually find a first industrial policy in colonial India being formulated. This again in early part of the 20th century. And two, if you look at trace the factors contributing to the dynamism of the leather goods industry in Tamil Nadu, can actually trace it back to a series of interventions that took place in Madras presidency in early part of the century. The second phase corresponds to the post-1947 period up until 1967 when the DMK comes to power. So 1947 to 1967 was a period when the Congress government was in power. But however, the mobilization by the Dravidian movement, both by the DMK seeking to come to seeking electoral power, political power, and the Dravida Kazhagam, which is essentially operating in the terrain of civil society, they continuously articulated a sentiment of regional neglect, which pushed the Congress government to initiate several efforts to launch industries in the state, unlike what the Congress government did in several other states. The last two phases correspond to what happens after the two Dravidian parties come to power. The first of it continues to be part of the state-led industrialization phase. So during which we find active support for industrialization and setting up of new public authorities to promote industrialization, like the State Industries Corporation, Promotion Corporation of Tamil Nadu, and the Tamil Nadu Small Industries Development Corporation, and so on. You find industrial clusters being set up by public authorities, as well as support for infrastructure, particularly transport and electricity. The last phase coincides with the post-reform period that saw an increase in the role of regional governments in attracting private investments. What is particularly interesting about this phase is how the state recast itself as a facilitator of resource mobilization for growth. Importantly, what happens during this phase is that the long-term investments in higher education translated into investments into capital accumulation among sections of lower castes. So what we found during our fieldwork is that often entrepreneurs from lower castes, from second generation families, were the ones who kind of who managed to access technical education, worked in the private domain before setting up enterprises of their own. So several entrepreneurs from lower castes and endowed with technical capabilities emerged during this period. A simultaneity of growth and inclusive development was therefore established. So this has to do with the domain of capital accumulation. Another domain that we map at length in the book is clearly that of labor relations and labor welfare. Here we make a distinction between rural labor and urban labor because of the differential nature of embedding of labor relations in these two locations. We first take the issue of address rural labor. So traditionally, access to land was critical to shaping of labor hierarchies in the rural. So if you look at earlier studies on Tamil Nadu, they suggest that land reforms was not as successful here compared to say Kerala or West Bengal. What we do was nuance this position by pointing out that though land reforms were not pushed through strongly by legislation at one stroke, transfers from upper caste landlords to lower caste tenant farmers did take place through a series of molecular interventions and pressure from collective mobilization. Such interventions and pressure has led to a near absence of tenancy in the regions that were once known for exploitative landlord-tenant relations. While lands were largely transferred to backward castes, in the southern belt, Dalits also benefited from such transfers. Landlordism has therefore declined in most parts of the state. Further, rural power was also undermined by democratizing administrative structures in rural areas when hereditary appointments were being replaced with public recruitment for positions like village administrative officers and so on. And if we can recall, in Dravidian common sense, social justice was primarily imagined in terms of democratic access to the modern sectors and help lower castes move out of caste-inscribed occupations such as agricultural labor. In line with this imperative, we established that investments in physical and social infrastructure have enabled labor, rural labor, lower caste labor in particular, to diversify away from agriculture much more than any other region in the country. In parallel, welfare interventions such as subsidized food through the public distribution system and caste mobilization have also undermined hierarchical labor relations in the rural. Together, they have enabled relatively higher wage increases, reduced rural caste disparities to an extent, and facilitated entry into the non-farm and the urban. So we now focus on transitions in the domain of urban labor. The experience of Tamil Nadu's interventions in this domain provides a solution to an interesting puzzle. A state which has embraced economic reforms, including the key tenets of labor market flexibility, also does relatively better with regard to wages, working conditions, and social protection for labor in both organized and unorganized sectors. The share of wages in organized manufacturing, as you can see from the slide, is much higher than other industrially dynamic states like Gujarat and Maharashtra. Contractualization levels are also much lower. Unionization too is more widespread in Tamil Nadu compared to other industry dynamic states with higher union density, more membership, and spread across sectors despite the absence of a strong mainstream left party in the state. So how do we kind of explain this? So we explain this emergence of relatively better conditions in terms of the distinction that Richard Sennett makes in his book Together between what he refers to as the social left and the political left in the context of left mobilization in the West. To him, when he talks about political left, he essentially talks about hierarchical party-based kind of mobilization, which emphasizes top-down approach and also unity of ideas, which according to him can actually can lead to fragmentation of multiple which can prevent alliances being formed across similar sympathetic kind of social groups. He contrasts this kind of a political left kind of mobilization with what he calls a social left, which is much more accommodative, which is bottom up, which emphasizes alliance building across similarly with groups with similar kinds of concerns. Which he says has potential but has not actually been realized because of the dominance of the political left in the West. So in the context of Tamil Nadu, so we argue that the Dravidian mobilization created the space for associational alliances across a range of subaltern groups, and this embedding of this labor movement within such kind of solidarities explains to a good deal the extent to which the labor has been able to improve its bargaining power. So, in other words, the embedding of labor mobilization within a larger subaltern identity has allowed them to bargain better with capital. This has also been made possible because of the advances made in human capital formation. Relatively higher wages because of such empowerment could be offset by access to better quality labor inputs for competitive accumulation. We also show, just as in the case of rural labor, welfare interventions outside the domain of the workplace, such as PDS, contributing to labor, particularly in the informal economy. When conventional collective bargaining strategies seem to be weakening, this route to labor welfare has made possible a degree of protection for informal workers. And as Reena Agarwala has shown in the book, better functioning labor welfare boards for several segments of welfare workers, informal workers, have addressed the issue of social protection to an extent. So these are the range of domains that we have covered. Now, having laid out the factors and processes that contribute to better development outcomes, we finally wrap up with a critical evaluation of the development experience and its implications for development politics in the global South. Though we argue that the state's political and development trajectory approximates what Chantal Mouffe labels as left populism, we identify three broad sets of constraints to its expansion. One in the domain of federal relations, the second emerging due to limits of modernization itself, and the third internal to the logic of populist mobilization of a heterogeneous set of social groups. To begin with, there are limits to the extent to which rights-based interventions can be carried out within a subnational terrain, given the limits posed by pan-Indian polity and judiciary. The recent verdict of the Supreme Court that mandates a common entrance test for medical colleges is a typical example. Further, The growing asymmetry in federal relations that we have witnessed in the last years in terms of both resource transfers as well as powers to chart autonomous development pathways not only reduces access to resources to invest in human development, but importantly, it reduces the ability of the subnational state to respond to popular demands autonomously at the subnational scale. As a result, what we witness is an expanding terrain of economic popular policies that address issues of absolute poverty rather than that of relative inequality. Similarly, macroeconomic factors, the growing integration with markets in particular, generate some constraints. For example, in line with global trends, the share of wages, despite being higher than higher states, has been steadily falling. Labor markets too are increasingly insecure. Though levels of contractualization is lower, the need to attract investments is likely to limit this process, or for that matter, even the possibility of introducing affirmative action policies in the private sector, as some radical groups have been kind of demanding. The labor question, going by the experience of states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, is actually increasingly being resolved through access to global labor markets. Tamil Nadu has in fact emerged as a major source of remittances in the country, with an expanding regime of labor mobility driven by investments in human development. But with growing restrictions to such global labor mobility, there are clear constraints to this process as well. This gets compounded by the limits posed by the logic of modernization per se. Despite having the largest share of its population in manufacturing and a sustained economic dynamism, the state has not been able to increase the share of employment in manufacturing, nor has it been able to absorb the increasing entry of educated youth from lower castes on what can broadly be seen as decent terms. Recent interpretations of the history of modernization suggests that such a phenomenon does in fact have a longer history. As Partha Chatterjee observes in a recent paper, even in early modern Europe, which has served as the template for building a theory of economic modernization, surplus populations that were dismembered from land could never entirely be transformed into necessary labor for capital. So this exhaustion of the social popular within the logic of modernization by necessity increases the domain of the economic popular. As a result, the logic of equivalence, which Kalai was pointing out earlier when he's elaborating the framework across demands made by heterogeneous groups through a Dravidian Tamil identity, is now weakened by the governmental logic of difference. Welfare interventions are targeted at specific groups and also are not always meant to transform the social relations that are generative of relations of power. This may feed into unevenness across these heterogeneous groups and generate new differences. Such factors, including the limits of affirmative action policies and uneven development within the state, have led to the rise of a range of disparities. Some are intra-caste, that is within caste. Many are inter-caste, both between backward caste and within Dalits, across these segments. So this has led to challenges to the holding together of the Dravidian bloc, which Kalai pointed out earlier. So the extent to which populist mobilization can reorient its terrain to forge appropriate demands in the new context, given these limits to modernization, given the limits posed by federal relations, and given the macroeconomic conditions, is likely to shape the possibilities of further expansion of substantive democracy. Even outside of such limits, we are also witnessing certain trends, such as unevenness in the quality of healthcare and education that Kalai alluded to earlier in the talk. Poor learning outcomes amongst school children in the state have been noted, as well as a growing preference for private schools, not only among the elites, but even among marginalized social groups. In a similar vein, a significant share of the population relies on private healthcare facilities for hospitalization. So this seems to suggest that we're witnessing a segmentation of the healthcare and education system based on perceived or real differences in quality. So these are all, second generation issues, which are kind of emerging, and right now they're not being kind of addressed, except at the margins. There is also recent evidence of shortages of human resources in some segments in the public health system. The consequent increase in out-of-pocket expenditure for marginal households and welfare implications are clearly obvious. Further, the emergence of chronic populism particularly in natural resource extraction sectors, have begun to open up new axes of economic inequalities. Nonetheless, what Tamil Nadu's experience suggests is that the question of dignity is inseparable from development for lower castes. With political labor, one can combine both, that is dignity and development, if it can build horizontal solidarity among heterogeneous caste groups and articulate a more substantive idea of social justice. Tamil Nadu's development experience can therefore well travel across other states in India and the global south, where status-based inequalities continue to encounter modernization. So we'll stop with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both the authors for that very rich overview. I'd like to hand straight away to Judith to take us through some comments in response both to what you've heard, but also to what you've read. And if I could encourage anyone in the audience who has questions bubbling away, please do use the Q&A box to post them, and then I'll kind of round them up and pose them to the authors in a moment. So over to you, Judith.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. It's a very great privilege to be able to talk with all of you, but especially to interact with Kalai and Bhaskar about a book which has been long in coming, but which is both very rich and I think also very courageous. I think I, of course, had the benefit of having read the manuscript, and thanks very much for that. And so I'm responding not just to what has been said, but also to what is actually in the book, which is much more detailed, of course. I wanted to say that I think, firstly, that the book is courageous and a lot of the claims it makes are very controversial and should, I think, provoke a very good discussion of some of the issues that really matter in respect to all of what you've been talking about. The general argument that the state record shows that inclusivity and economic development can be successfully pursued together is of course true. On the other hand, I think the record is not nearly as successful as is claimed in the book. So one of the things I think I want to take you up on is that I think the case is really strongly overstated, and we need to think a lot more about what the problems have been along the way and what the difficulties are in pursuing such policies. I think it's very interesting and valuable to have the comment that the state's role in promoting economic development has been strong, as well as its role in promoting social development, because of course so much of the literature has assumed that it's the social development for which Tamil Nadu state particularly is to be celebrated. And then I think the question that needs to exercise a lot of us is the question of where Dalits come in on all this. I think the record of inclusivity as far as Dalits is concerned is much weaker than the book suggests, and is much weaker than that on the other backward castes, the other lower caste groups. And I want to flag that, and I want to get that into the discussion. So to start with, I would say that the Tamil Nadu record, of course, has been very impressive. And my work, which has been very much based in villages in Tamil Nadu, confirms to me so much of what you're saying has been impressive about the achievements of Tamil Nadu. But the downside of what's been happening in Tamil Nadu is also quite serious and quite difficult to acknowledge. There have been very serious problems, as Kalai had alluded to, in quality of education, and the inequality now in education is very much a quality question. I think it's not a question of how many people are enrolled, it's much more a question of which quality they get. There have been serious health problems which are not easily captured in the simple metrics that we all usually use in order to evaluate the health achievements. And the question of the low wage economy, I mean, I think it's one thing to say that the wage share is large, but so is the employment share. And the fact that Tamil Nadu's wages are somewhat higher than those in some of the other states doesn't say very much. So the problems along the way, I think, are not acknowledged nearly seriously enough, nearly well enough in trying to show the achievements and how strong the achievements have been. It would have been helpful, I think, also to have more on the obstacles, the resistance that has been faced in pursuing these policies, especially if one's trying to think about the more general question of, can they easily be pursued elsewhere, and is this a general model that can be followed? The point I want to labour, well, firstly, is to say that the comparisons, when you're looking at Tamil Nadu in comparison with Maharashtra and Gujarat, that may be quite easy. It may be quite easy to show that Tamil Nadu does better. But if you made comparisons with some of the Southeast Asian countries, for example, or other countries you could pick on, I think it would make the Tamil Nadu record look much less strong. And I think that's a very interesting question that one could look at a bit more seriously, the comparison with states outside India, to see where India's overall problems are still so serious. So now, the point I really want to take up on is the fact that Tamil Nadu remains a state in which it's generally acknowledged that casteism is very strong, very deep-seated, that the caste problem is still very serious, particularly for Dalits, but not just for Dalits. So that the very strong antagonism to Dalits and very strong caste antagonisms between other caste groups as well remains, to many, a very surprising feature of Tamil Nadu when compared with other states which have not had such progressive policies and which have not been known for their progressive policies. So a central question in my mind is always whether it is precisely this emphasis on caste and caste inclusivity and the policies that have been pursued in that respect that has, in a sense, reinforced the importance of caste and has made casteism more important than it is in other states. But of course, that would be too simplistic. It's also a question of the history. It's also a question of how these very strong caste prejudices and very strong deep-seated caste antagonisms have evolved in Tamil Nadu and have continued to be so difficult to counter. Then, of course, it's not just a question of why they've been so strong, but also the backlashes to any of the policies which seem to be improving the lot of some of the weaker castes and the Dalits, which, again, have been very serious in Tamil Nadu. So I think one of the things that the book doesn't address enough is the difference between the OBCs and the SCs. The fact that it's all very well to say that the SCs have also improved their position. They have benefited from some of the policies, but they've benefited so much less. And there are still such serious problems of violence as well as general disadvantage amongst the SCs. Another point I would like to raise is the question of gender. I know that the book is not really about gender, but I think it would have been helpful to make a stronger point about why. If you're talking about inclusivity and you're talking about the Dravidian ideology and you're talking about where the Dravidian movement came from, gender was a very important part of all that. And gender inclusivity is a very important part of inclusivity. The Tamil Nadu record, again, as far as gender is concerned, is surprisingly bad. And there's surprising elements of gender violence, gender disadvantage in conjunction with policies which look on the surface to be trying quite hard to address gender disparity and gender disadvantage. And I appreciate the fact that you might not have wanted to include this. It's not something that the book is really about, but I think it would have been helpful to at least have a stronger statement about that. Something similar might be said about some of the environmental questions. So the whole question of sand and sand mining, but which you discuss in some detail in the book, is discussed, I think, much more as a corruption problem and a problem of politics than a production problem, and the devastating effect it's having on some of the productive systems in the state, but much more so water and the whole problem of water poverty and water shortages. And you only have to go through some of the slum areas or some of the poorer areas of Chennai to see endless water queues, the way in which the poorer sections of the population are suffering, particularly from water shortages. So the environmental questions, I think, could have come up a bit more than they do, and I don't think it's easy to say that they are irrelevant, as it were, to the questions that you're dealing with. Now, another thing I want to say is that I think it's a very interesting book on the state and state policy and what the state has done. But I think too much is attributed to the actions of the state. A lot of what has happened has been outside of the control of the state. And one of the more interesting arguments that you have in the book is about land reform and the fact that it hasn't been primarily instigated by the state. It's happened in a way incidentally, or happened as a result of other forces and other factors. But the general problem, I think, in the book is that it's assuming a bit too strong a role for the state, and it's not giving enough acknowledgement of some of the processes and some of the developments that are not really directly attributed to the state, but happen for other reasons. I find it disappointing too that there is not more recognition of the vast amount of research that's been done at the micro level in Tamil Nadu. And it may be that it was too much to bring in, but Tamil Nadu is one of the better research states in India at the micro level. There's a lot of social and economic research that's been very rich over a long period of time, including research to which both of you have contributed. And I find it disappointing that not more of it is alluded to or is used in making the general arguments. Finally, I'd just like to say something, I don't want to speak for too long, but say something about the future. I think that the question of what happens in the future in Tamil Nadu is a very big question, not just from the point of view in which you discuss it, from the fact that this may be an era that's exhausted its possibilities. It may be that the no fruits have been picked. It may be that the fissures have been developing inevitably as part of the policies, and that it's not possible to see this as continuing indefinitely. But there's also the big question of the change in the political map with Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi having gone, and the change in political possibilities which Tamil Nadu now faces in the future, not least, of course, also recognizing how devastating the COVID restrictions have been. And I think the big question for the future must be whether the underlying commitment to Dravidian ideology, the common sense commitment to Dravidian ideology, is going to be strong enough to continue at least some of the progressive policies that have been pursued up to now. And I'd like to hear your sense of what you think the future possibilities might be and what the future difficulties might be, other than this question of exhausting the possibilities of the low-hanging fruits. In general, I like to say that I think this is an incredibly impressive and very courageous book. I think it's very provocative, and I think it deserves a lot of attention. I hope it will get the discussion, it will provoke the discussion that it deserves. I find it incredibly stimulating and incredibly interesting. And thank you both very much for having produced it. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Judith. If you can bear it, Kalai and Vidya Bhaskar, I might pose some additional questions to you that are coming through in the chat and then ask you to respond in the round. But I know that's a tall order because Judith's comments are already very rich, but let me pose a few more questions to you. Several people have asked about the private-public mix in education and in healthcare, especially in hospitals, and to what extent you take into account the corporatization and privatization in health in your study. Karen Kapadia asks a couple of questions. I'll ask them together. She firstly asks what consequences a BJP ADMK future might have in Tamil Nadu, whether this would break the Dravidian model, and I think that builds on where Judith ended as well. And she also emphasizes the point that Judith has also made, that Tamil Nadu's record in relation to Dalits should be distinguished from the record in relation to Dalits has been much poorer than you suggest, and invites further comment on the position of Dalits in particular. And just a slightly different question, which again, Judith sort of pointed to the question of environmental problems and water scarcity. Vishwanathan Venkatraman, who's a PhD student here at King's, asks a question about urban public health infrastructure provision, and how this compares with other Indian states like Gujarat and Maharashtra, given the importance for health outcomes and urbanization. You talked in your presentations broadly about Tamil Nadu's investment in infrastructure, but what about those particular areas of public health infrastructure? To what extent does Tamil Nadu present a distinctive picture there? So I'll pause there and give you the opportunity to respond. So I don't know who would like to go first.
Can I want to start? Or you want me to go? No.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, either way, okay, yeah. Just maybe I'll leave it with them a lot of questions with the political in nature. I will confine only of mine more of the economic and development process. I can find that. I take a few questions, which I mean, and address, then maybe I'll come back to maybe after Professor Bhaskar addresses the other questions. The one I begin with of the quality of education and quality of health, which is fairly recorded, absolutely no doubt about it. Only caveat to is this increase in the quantity terms is also equally important, because if you look at the current policies last 5 years of the Federal Planning Commission, all the policies targeting the numbers. We will achieve 2020 this much number, 2025 this much number, something. So which Tamil Nadu need not to do now. At least now it can concentrate or be forced to concentrate on the quality of the services. For instance, take the example of GER, the grant enrollment ratio for the higher education. It's a current government target to achieve 50% at maybe 10 years period of time, which already the state has. It's now the focus should be more on the quality of the terms. What is this? And how that even the higher education GE are also very segmented. There are, of course, the better colleges, poorer colleges, courses that actually has a direct implications to the labor market. Who gets what, what terms, occupation, etc. That is something is, so what I'm trying to say is within education domain, the question of quality is definitely an issue with the new reality. That's what I'm trying to argue. So definitely this is a product of whatever that has happened is a product of combination of all of this. So no, absolutely when we compare what is the measurable thing available in the most of the indicators. So if you look at any comparative studies, we have certain measures to compare in terms of health and education, which is very standard indicator, is either across country or within the countries. Of course, we need a more micro study level. There's the one like there's another book called Time Pass. There's a book which came in, with the rest. So similarly, one has to do a micro study level how it works. So definitely in terms of, again, the quality of the health services, say, even take the fertility rate reduction or the IMR or MMR, which is for safe delivery, which is almost 99%. People have a question that whether the delivery actually, what are the process, how much actually, the care was given around the time, and the way the doctors treated in the public sector is quite different than what the private sector treats. All of these issues needs to be sorted out. Of course, it is really a lot to be decided, and of course there are serious problems to it. and also indifference of the bureaucrats, local bureaucrats or local medical system. But that doesn't actually, tell us much. I mean, doesn't actually stop us telling what has actually happened so far. So this process, this book is some way of trying to map the current situation, how this evolved. If you have a numbers in aggregate in terms of certain indicators, we're trying to explain why that took place. Obviously, that is definitely not a case that it is all, issues with the rest of the issues are excluded from that in terms of quality of the services in public health. I also combine this question with the corporatization and public health. Absolutely. As I mentioned myself in the beginning of the health chapter, in fact, the Apollo template was given in the Tamil Nadu, where later actually traveled that corporatization of other hospital. Only aspect puzzling me is, even if you take the cutoff year as 90, 80s, late 80s, it came the Apollo 90. If you look at the additional number of hospital done by the public has not stopped. In fact, every district has one of the now, which is actually target. I don't know, it began in from 2001 to 2006 time or before. I don't know exact years when that began. So that if you look at the total capacity, if you have a measure, the doctors available per population, beds available per population, and nurses available per population has actually increased, even in the public sector. So now I also don't know of the answer as to how this coexistence of the public health and private corporatization together, rampant privatizations together. Obviously, as Professor Bhaskar mentioned, that definitely there is a segmentation, who gets to the public, who goes to the private. Obviously, if you look at the quintile, I mean, there's a record done actually. If you look at the latest, the health survey, which NSSO does, if you, distribute the caretakers, care seekers in the public sector by quintile of their income status, obviously you will see the bottom 2 quintile of who would go to the public more. Obviously, it is segmented in that sense of the class segmentation, definitely. So there's no doubt about it. But question I'm not sure is, this corporatization whether will allow, and so far it has, this created a segmentation, but it will completely undermine the public sector. I'm not sure. I don't know now, as of now, but definitely this is a serious issue. I mean, no doubt about it. But as of now, the 30-year experience says the per cap, if you look at the measurable way of doctors per population or the better range of indicators, you would find the increase in that. It goes along with it. But in the future would certainly undermine. Obviously, it's all known in the other countries, other contexts. It has done, but Tamil Nadu would not be would not be withstand that pressure. Definitely would go in that direction. But whether there is any counterforce to arrest that process, that to be explored more on that. This is with quality and quantity of education and health. With one generalizable, of course. Again, see, as we begin with, India is a federal country. It's in fact, we know the Professor Louis' work actually tells us much about what has happened since 2014 of the way in which the center actually threatening on the state powers. We know historically also the asymmetry of power between the center and state. If you look at health and education expenditure, 80% of the expenditure come from the state. Whereas the revenue capacity or the ability to have a thing is completely asymmetrical. So, and this is one level. Second, another level, there is also well researched last few years. There is also other mechanism the state is trying to truncate this autonomous path of the center is trying to truncate the autonomous path of development through this what we call centrally sponsored scheme, so that we all know now, well researched, that how it actually shapes the priorities that the state has already. So what you are having is 2 levels of intervention happening from the center, which is one level of you call as a truncated, what you call as a asymmetry of relations, in the sense you have an expenditure on the burden of the state, which is also specific to the state education and health, and you don't have a capacity to get the money for that in expenditure. This is an asymmetry relationship in that. On top of that, you also have a new set of policy intervening or encroaching the state spaces in the policy domain, particularly on this expenditure on the welfare. So this too, because it's for electoral reasons for the central or maybe the other ideological reasons, but it has a huge, serious implications on the ground for whether state will be able to maintain, sustain its own autonomous path anymore is serious question now. It's the way it is the barriers, the way it's crumbling actually of the state infrastructure, its own ability to maintain that. So I'm not sure even to make this claim anymore, the subnational studies, the way in which now centralization is happening, obviously, what kind of comparative studies would be able to do within the state when you do not have a policy paths different, because it's been curtailed in many ways. So this is second generalizable to other countries, which I'm not sure, given our federal work. As I said, it's a subnational unit with a limited power. How much this can, because I mean, you need to have a certain decision and autonomous ways to compare with one unit to the other unit. I'm not sure that can be comparable to the other countries, but for India as a whole, maybe the subnational state to the similar power structure, asymmetric power structure in the federal state of a country can be comparable with one region to other region. So that is something I can think of. Third, with question of the caste, which is between the Dalit or non-Dalit and the within the Judith mentioned of the within the backward caste, also there's a caste feeling as in, because obviously it's just no doubt if you look at number of indicators, atrocities, numbers, this is mind-boggling. It's like a very, very atrocious, no doubt about. But I am also not sure in the sense whether in terms of development indicators or the process of development were excluded, which I'm not sure. Why I'm not sure, I make a very specific claim here. There's this data factually, if you look at in terms of education, inclusion in the job market, inclusion, that cannot be simply wished away, those facts. I guess these are odd facts to be in the public education in the domain, but in the cultural and social domain, violence exists. For instance, take the book of, I'm only supporting this evidence with, say, the book by recent Amit Aguja's work, which is actually, I was actually surprised. This was only, I was thinking of it always having this problem. While data-wise, it shows in indicators, better indicators, why there's so much talk on the ground. So then his work comes and tells, this is exactly the place in the Maharashtra too. He was telling, he was actually comparing 4 states, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu at one level, another level Gujarat, another level UP and BR and another level. He says this is 2 complete trajectory of social mobilization, where one social mobilization gives you an opportunity for the subaltern groups to exercise, negotiate with the different political parties and come to power. It is not, since Tamil Nadu doesn't have a, say, BSP, Bahudin Samaj Party, doesn't mean the Dalit disempowerment. He says, in fact, that is an empowerment in the sense that the agency actually able to negotiate with the different political parties better, in better record. That's what his research shows. So in that sense, I am with this indicators inclusion, there is no, but definitely in the other question of atrocities, is it caste-based policies necessarily generates cost consciousness and actually continues to persist in civil and social domain? I don't know. This is something I think historians and the culture, I mean, it's a long question, whether the reservation policy brought the caste or the caste brought the reservation policy. And it's very, very contested debate. But nonetheless, one thing I can say in terms of level and terms of rate, which is the 2 comparable indicators economists would do generally of the certain indicators, in the sense, in that account, the state actually does relatively better. But what Judith also saying of the social domain and the violence, is it because of the relative improvement which leads to the anxiety among the dominant results into caste conflict, is something obviously we need to count of the specific case studies, which is true, that now well recorded as well. But I don't know it is called as a deprivation which leads to the thing. It is actually the upward mobility which generates this anxiety among the dominants, which is we also see in the other state of the BJP coming into power. In many states, there's an attempt to reverse the gains that made by, for the subalterns in most of the contexts in India. I think I'll stop. Maybe I'll come back to these questions. Now, the rest, maybe I'll give it to Professor Bhaskar.
Yeah, thank you, Kalai. I think you have covered a lot of ground. I think, I just kind of probably qualify, I just add something to what Kalai already had to, stated. Coming to the issue of quality, again, so these are all kind of new issues which have cropped up with the growing privatization, which is, again, there's nothing unique to Tamil Nadu. Even if you look at Kerala, you find the same phenomenon happening. And both Tamil Nadu and Kerala is a very paradoxical kind of situation where, in terms of data, they tell us that learning outcomes in public schools are better than in private schools. But in both states, there's a growing preference, particularly among the vulnerable sections, to access private education. So this is something, which we need to kind of look at in greater detail. And and again, the interesting thing again in Tamil Nadu is if you look at the qualification of teachers, who are there, and in the caste profile of teachers, all of them are much, much better than, most states. So, and then despite that, you do not have the learning outcomes that's to be expected from that kind of investment. This something, that we need to kind of look at. But however, just before the COVID, there was, I was had a interview. We interviewed the education secretary, and she was telling us that in fact the government is very well aware of this issue, and apparently they have given instructions to all government schools saying that the focus should no longer be on marks but on learning outcomes. So they're trying to kind of see how that can be done. They're trying to kind of initiate processes whereby teachers can be trained to kind of do such things and so on. Whether it will succeed, or the fact that marks become such an important gateway to the world of higher education and to mobility. See, right now, if you look at aspirations, access to higher education, and from there to decent jobs, that's the driving force for most households. Yeah. And we need to kind of recognize these investments and these learning outcomes in relation to what's happening. Now, Judith, you talked about next about the low wage economy. Clearly, yes, relatively Tamil Nadu does better. But even if you look at other states, if you said Maharashtra and Gujarat, we just took those states because invariably, we look at industrial dynamism, economic dynamism. These are the states that are normally kind of, discussed as models. That's why we took them. Probably if you look at Kerala, it may show things a bit differently. See, but Kerala, the problem is slightly different. Yeah, because you don't really have productive dynamism. So what has happened in Kerala is, this investments in human capital essentially translated into remittances, and remittances in turn, generated certain kinds of service sectors, which is a very, very contingent kind of, development process. It happens, it's peculiar to history, peculiar to geography. So to kind of actually compare Kerala, in terms of productive dynamism, or, what happens in the economic front, I'm not discounting the importance of how this movement led to investments in education and health, but what it meant for the productive domain is something, it's a very, very contingent thing, and it's very hard to kind of compare. So these low wages, for me, there's something with Kalai, I think we've all kind of spoken about. Is there a way out? We are a subnational region operating within a macroeconomic framework, which talks about labor market flexibility. You look at the new wage bills, wage codes, which have been introduced. And there is constant pressure among states to kind of, and you look at the kind of laws that have initiated in Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. Now, how long can a state government like Tamil Nadu hold on, saying that, we are not going to kind of, relax our labor market laws? It's not going to be easy, going forward. Because right now, clearly, inequality is not an issue at all. If you look at the policy thrust, it's growth at all costs. And the assumption is that growth will kind of lift boats. And that seems to be the primary kind of a thrust. And then as Kalai was talking earlier, so within all this, you also have a highly centralized polity now, centralized framework, so which completely cuts across what has happened earlier. If you look at most of these big ticket social programs that happened, which is initiated by the union government, like MNRG and so on, all this were actually, inspired by subnational welfare models, like be it the noon meal scheme, be it the NREGA, be it the health insurance scheme. But all these things have now been kind of taken over by the union government. And then the space for such autonomous interventions are completely being squeezed. So to what extent, going forward, you can actually, the kind of autonomy that we have spoken about, this book allows us to kind of speak about, this actually going to be realized, secured in the future, is a big, big question, for which we need to kind of wait and watch and hopefully be optimistic about. Yeah, that's micro level studies. Wherever possible, we have tried to kind of do that. And again, to reiterate what Kalai said, our framework, the entire project of the book is this, right? So in terms of relative terms, Tamil Nadu has done better than other states on certain parameters. And then we have tried to provide some explanations as to how that was possible. And within that, we have kind of sidelined certain issues. Some of these issues that you alluded to about the question of water shortage, water pollution, or gender for that matter. So we do kind of talk about gender in terms of access to education, healthcare, and also labor force participation. But that's really, doesn't do adequate justice to the gender question at all. We do know in rural Tamil Nadu, the wage differentials between male and female labor are quite kind of wide. And we also know a set of reasons as to why that's kind of happening. So clearly on that front, we have not done much. And then this question on public mix, on public-private partnerships. Again, I mean, all that I can say is, so if you look at the health insurance program, for example, so health insurance in Tamil Nadu is available. Anybody, in the BPL category can avail of the state instituted health insurance scheme. And with that, they can access either the public healthcare facilities or the private healthcare facilities, So to that extent, as going back to what Kale was talking about, it's possible that there is a check on private healthcare facilities, because public healthcare facilities can, I'm not saying that they are at the moment because we don't have evidence for that, but at least they can kind of provide a check, to whatever negative issues that health insurance policies are found to kind of lead to. In the case of Andhra, for example, which is one of the earliest states to kind of implement this. So I think that's about it. I think I don't think. Yeah, the caste issue, I think Kale has mentioned. That's about it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We have reached our formal kind of ending time for the seminar. So I'm going to propose that we do something that we did for our last book discussion, which worked rather nicely actually, which is that we will end our formal proceedings now and stop the recording, but invite anyone who hasn't managed to ask their question yet or who would actually like to talk with the authors